Hello, welcome, Cabbage here. For Final Fantasy VII Ever Crisis, let's do a sales report video. And sorry that I missed March, but I have been busy with Nier Reincarnation shutting down and then playing Elden Ring. But I'm still very interested in the topic, so let's do this video, let's do more in the future. But as I have said in previous installments, this series is really about looking at Square Enix and the Japanese mobile video game industry. And now is a very interesting time to be covering the topic, so yeah, I will be continuing this series. Also, we can talk about the poor sales of Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, and think about why that's happening. And then for the list of games that I'm going to show the results for, I'm going to consolidate the list a little bit. I cut some of the ones that I felt were less relevant to the conversation. But here are the Final Fantasy mobile games. Ever Crisis still doing strong, hovering around 2 million. Final Fantasy Brave Exvius is low. This has got to be on the chopping block. The game has gone almost 10 years now, which is more than satisfactory, I think. And then War of the Visions as well, I think maybe barely hanging in there, but I don't know. We should maybe keep an eye on that as well. But Record Keeper, also very low, so I don't know. Also a long-running game. No shame in shutting it down now, I would say. But yeah, Ever Crisis, strong. I don't think there's any worries for the rest of the year, 2024. Looking at other Square Enix games, Romance and Saga Re-Universe, this is always a solid performer. Performing pretty similarly to Ever Crisis this month. But Twatsugai and Octopath may be also in trouble. Twatsugai for sure has got to be shutting down this year. I made the guess that it was going to shut down around its 1-year anniversary, which I think is going to be in a couple months or so. So look out for that. Yeah, it didn't even start well, so to be hanging around at this level, not good. And then we have the Dragon Quest games. These are really the gems in the crown of the Square Enix mobile game roster. But Dragon Quest Walk doing very well, and Dragon Quest Tact very solid. Again, just because they shut down the global version does not mean that the JP version is going to go anywhere. But the newest game, Dragon Quest Champions, not doing well. I would also guess that is going to shut down around the 1-year anniversary mark. And then Schoolgirl Striker is doing even better than Champions, so I don't think that's going anywhere either. Alright, and then finally the heavy hitters that are not Square Enix, the Korean Nikkei, very solid, 5 million or 10 million. Honkai Star Rail and Genshin Impact, very, very strong. Umu Musume, crazy month of March with about 50 million USD. Big drop-off for April for sure, but I think people are starting to save. I think there's like a guaranteed pull or something the next month, or like an anniversary coming soon, so yeah, people are saving. And then Monster Strike, solid overall. But yeah, the mobile game bubble has burst. I've said this many times, and I think some people hear that phrase and think that means that the industry will disappear, but that is not what that means. It just means that the gold rush is over, and much fewer games and companies will be successful from now, as compared to the peak during the decade of the 2010s. And I don't know, maybe Square Enix is looking at getting out of the industry almost totally. I predict that they are going to be maybe downsizing from now. But next, let's investigate the question, what is the goal for Final Fantasy VII Ever Crisis? I believe from the publisher's point of view, it's to have the game continue until the release of the third installment of Final Fantasy VII. That is probably 3 or 4 years out, which is very optimistic for a mobile game. But Square Enix is putting a lot into their Final Fantasy VII push, and I personally consider it the last hurrah of this era of the company before it downsizes, so they might force the mobile game to continue, even if it performs poorly and the user base shrinks. But of course, there is a limit. If it's just not doing anything and it's in the red too much, then they will shut it down. And then I say last hurrah for this era of Square Enix, but again, that does not mean that the company is going to disappear, either the publisher or the developer. It's just going to shrink as far as scope and the number of releases, I predict. But yeah, the purpose of Ever Crisis and pretty much all other mobile games based on IPs that have big console releases every few years is to fill the time in between releases, to keep the IP fresh in users' minds as they wait for the next release. And we have the next, Final Fantasy VII release announced and on the horizon, so ideally, Ever Crisis would help in the intermittent years to lead up to and support the release of the next game, but we'll see if that happens. And that leads us to the poor sales of Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, and we can think about why that is happening. To put it in context, it is apparently doing worse than Final Fantasy XVI over a similar period of time, which is already disappointing based on previous mainline numbered Final Fantasy releases. The official statement on the low sales are blaming the slow adoption of the PlayStation 5 console. Final Fantasy VII Rebirth is a PS5 exclusive, so yeah, that makes sense. But also, the console has been out 5 years. That's an eternity in video game years, and so I don't think it works as an excuse anymore. And it also brings up the question, why isn't the PS5 selling? I have heard some theories saying that since Rebirth is the middle part of a trilogy, that is why people are skipping it. Like any big events or revelations that happen in Rebirth will probably be covered in the third installment, so they can just catch up then. But I don't believe that. A personal theory that I have is that the Midgar area and story is what people remember and associate most strongly with the original Final Fantasy VII. And so getting away from that area and that story maybe makes this second part less appealing. But then you could counter-argue that with open world games being, the hot format at the moment. So that should make this Rebirth more appealing than the kind of on-rails in Midgar Final Fantasy VII Remake. I don't know. An interesting theory that I heard recently, which is related to the PS5 exclusive nature of Rebirth, is that people are looking at the 5-year-old PS5 and guessing that the PS6 will be coming out soonish, which would line up with the release of Final Fantasy VII Part 3, and folks are waiting to get details on that console, like what if Final Fantasy VII Part 3 is a PlayStation 6 exclusive? What if PlayStation 5 games are playable on the PlayStation 6? Because of these concerns, maybe people are waiting to play Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, waiting to make a decision between buying a PS5 or a 6. But imagine playing Final Fantasy VII Remake on PlayStation 4, buying a PlayStation 5 to play Rebirth, and then buying a PlayStation 6 to play Part 3 of Final Fantasy VII. That's thousands of dollars that we're talking about, and I can understand especially casual folks balking at that. That could also be leading to low sales. Another thing that might be hurting sales is I feel like at this point, the Final Fantasy games are known primarily for two things: graphics and story. Final Fantasy XVI and Final Fantasy VII Remake, to people that know, they have fun battle and exploration gameplay, but I think the general audience, video game audience at large, does not know this. They know only about the graphics and the story. And then we're in an era where folks are watching games on YouTube or Twitch, and so a lot of people, they may be watching, Final Fantasy and getting what they expect, but they're not playing it, and so that means people are not buying it. To be honest, I feel like Final Fantasy as a whole has lost its way, and folks are kind of moving on. We can argue about when it happened. You can make the case as far back as the move to Sony, you can go as recent as Final Fantasy 13 or 15, but I think we can all agree that Final Fantasy is no longer true to its roots. Yes, it still has chocobos and Cid and all of that, but that's really window dressing. What I'm talking about is a focus on fidelity, cinematics, minigames, international marketing efforts, merchandising, aiming for hipness factor, trying to be everything to everyone. And what's lost is focus and restraint and vision in an identity. You compare that to Dragon Quest, which is you kind of know what you're going to get every single game that comes out, and that's comforting. And so I feel like that's part of the reason why Dragon Quest is more successful. I feel like Final Fantasy's flailing a little bit. But at this point, I don't even know what a return to form for Final Fantasy would even look like. Perhaps that is kind of being played out in the mobile space, but as we're seeing, the Final Fantasy mobile games aren't performing well either, so I don't know. Square Enix might be in a bind as for what to do with the Final Fantasy name from now. But yeah, that is a look at the results. Square Enix is definitely going through a transitional period, and I'd be interested to hear what people have to say about that, and more specifically, mobile games and Final Fantasy VII Ever Crisis. Okay, thanks for watching, and we'll see you again. Take care.